Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya vaidakena yopa kuruttam pravaram muninam padanjalim pranchali ranatosmi stuve padanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam katra sutrasya bhashyasya krama vivaranasya cha. I suppose that some of you might have joined after I finished the first few sessions, during which I give an elaborate exposition and description of these two verses, which are the verses of invocation that the traditional schools they used to chant before the beginning of the Yoga Sutras discussion. The first one is a tribute to the great Patanjali, who is the author of the Sutras. And he is supposed to have made some very unique contribution to not only yoga psychology, but also to Sanskrit grammar, and also the Indian school of medicine, known as Ayurveda. So, yogena chittasya padena vacham. So, vacham, malam, and chittasya malam. So, that way, malam sharirasya vaidakena. Malam means something that we remove, something that we throw out. You may call it, suppose, vacham malam means when we mispronounce a word, or when we do not use the right word in the right context, or when we are not using the language that is acceptable in polite circles, it is considered to be an impropriety. It's not the proper way of using language. So it is called malam. So how to use language with a sense of propriety, especially Sanskrit language. So in order to explain the nuances of Sanskrit grammar, syntax, and especially pronunciation, phonetics, Patanjali wrote what is considered to be the greatest exposition of language, philology, and linguistics. It's called Patanjala Mahabhashya. Mahabhashya means the huge, the great, grand commentary. Very huge work. This is his unique contribution to language, to phonetics, to etymology, syntax, in fact, linguistics and philology. It is not just a book on Sanskrit grammar, it is a great exposition of the philosophy of grammar, philosophy of language. And language is not something that we use just for communication. Language is a beautiful, sublime vehicle for us to convey our ideas in a way that gives a sense of peace and happiness to the listeners, and a sense of contentment to the speaker. So that's one contribution. Second contribution, that is Sharirasya Malam. Second contribution, he made a great commentary on Ayurveda, Ayurvedic text. According to most scholars, it is a book on Charaka Samhita. And some people will argue, some scholars will argue that Charaka Samhita itself is Patanjali's work on Indian school of medicine. And then, of course, the third great contribution, as we know, is Yoga Sutras, 195 sutras, divided into 4 chapters. The second verse is very important. That is a tribute to the succession of the lineage of teachers who taught and expounded Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, maybe during the last 2000 years. So, Stuve Patanjalim Vyasam Shankaram Cha Munitraya. Munitraya means the 3 great sages or saints, scholars. Who are they? Patanjali, the author of the sutras, Vyasa, the author of the commentary, the Bhashya, and Shankaracharya, who wrote a sub-commentary, maybe a super commentary, based on Vyasa's commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. It is called Vivarana. So that's why Stuve Patanjali Vyasam, Shankaram cha Munitrayam, Kartru Sutrasya Bhashyasya, Kramat Vivaranasya cha. So we pay tributes, obeisance to Patanjali, the author of the sutras, Vyasa, the author of the first and maybe the most foundational commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutras, and of course to Shankaracharya, who later on wrote a commentary on the Yoga Sutras based on Vyasa's commentaries on the Yoga Sutras. So this is the essence of the two verses of invocation that we normally chant every time when we discuss this subjects. So in the last session, I was discussing the importance of the practice of yamas and niyamas. Now the question may arise, see, what is the advantage? In what way does it help us emotionally? Or maybe in some ways, in what way does it help us in our day-to-day life and our interaction with others? If we practice these disciplines, yamas and niyamas, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha, shaucha, santosha, tapaswadhyaya, isar, nidhana. That is total non-violence, truthfulness, abstinence from theft, continence, and non-covetousness, and of course internal and external purity, cleanliness, contentment, austerity, study of holy scriptures, and a sense of surrender to God. In what way does it help us in our everyday life, especially in our emotional life? That's very important. So one important significance of the practice of yamas and niyamas. First of all, it gives you an innate faculty of what's called discretion. I mean, actually, a person who practices yamas and niyamas properly, he is accumulating the fuel with which he can continue his journey right up to the stage of samadhi. Because the plane has to move forward, so it needs a propeller, and it needs a controller, and also it needs fuel. So where do you get this energy to undertake this spiritual journey? Not only for spiritual journey, even to be a successful householder, whether you're father or mother, husband or wife, brother and sister, or if you want to really succeed in your professional life, in the workplace. If a person practices yamas or niyamas, you become a man or a woman of better judgment. You get an uplifting of consciousness, and you feel a kind of purification of our emotions and attitudes, and more importantly, a sense of freedom from negative tendencies that normally stand in our way of progress in our professional everyday life. So, and in fact, Yoga Sutras themselves, of course, the commentaries together, give a list of 10 negative tendencies. They're all listed in Sanskrit, but I shall try to translate in English. Krodha, mana, maya, lobha, ogha, loka, moha, dukkha, jugupsa, shoka. These are all Sanskrit terms, but I explain immediately we'll be able to connect, because these things we experience every day in our life. Only these ancient Sanskrit writers used in their own archaic expressions to explain this. First one is anger. It's common to everyone. Bitterness is one negative tendency. Not only righteous indignation, sometimes irrational anger. See, once we can understand this is a negative tendency to be overcome, then that negative tendency actually becomes weaker. Once we become aware of the fact that we are becoming unnecessarily angry, then with that realization, with that understanding that this anger is totally irrational, the anger goes down. Similarly, if a person becomes anxious, anxiety neurosis, or bitterness of any of these problems, when you become aware of this mischief that mind is playing with you, then you'll be able to get a handle on it, you'll be able to control it. Because you are objectifying, you are actually subjecting your own anger to observation, and you observe yourself becoming angry, so you become the witness of your own internal process. Then anger goes down. So also bitterness, all this. So that's krodha. The second one is mana, which is egoism. We should remember it is not self-confidence. It is not the feeling, well, I have to get the work done. I have to achieve certain things. Not that kind of assertiveness. It is a kind of senseless egotism, mana. Then maya, it's a kind of self-deception. We feel that mind is playing a trick with us. Lobha is greed. Once we understand greed is not such a wonderful thing to have, something to be got rid of, but you are not able to do that. But once you realize the need and the necessity to get rid of greed, then greed goes down. Ogha, it should be understood to be ogha vritti, because the word ogha has got many meanings in Sanskrit. It could mean it means a flood, inundation, or some flow. All these are the English equivalents of ogha. But here ogha is used to be a tendency. So it means a tendency to continuously brood over things unnecessarily, a tendency to depend upon others unnecessarily without relying upon oneself, being a parasite. It's called oghavritti. The next one is loka. It is a tendency to blindly follow others without using our own judgment, our own discretion. Blindly following something or somebody without making use of our own judgment. Then moha. Moha is a kind of being in a state of delusion. Dukkha, as you know, you can maybe in modern times you have to equate it with some kind of tendencies in the pathological side. For example, depression, melancholia. That is the real implication of the word dukkha when mentioned as one of the negative tendencies to be got rid of through the practice of yamas and niyamas. And then jugupsa, a kind of irrational, unnecessary aversion or disgust towards somebody or something. Shoka is again a feeling being depressed. Then these are the 10 negative tendencies which, according to Yoga Sutras, we can get rid of if we practice yamas and niyamas. To give an example, disgust, aversion, hatred, anger, related to himsa, violent tendencies. If we practice non-violence, we can get rid of this. Contentment, even of the niyamas. If you have contentment, you can get rid of greed. You can get rid of shoka, dukkha, a kind of melancholia, always in a state of dissatisfaction, unhappiness, always chasing worldly desires, worldly enjoyments, in spite of your full conviction that it is not good, still you follow that. So if a person practices santosha, it's called contentment. These things can be got rid of. So these are the 10 negative tendencies that one should try to get rid of by practicing yamas and niyamas. Of course, there are other explanations. Ahimsa, Satyavajanam, Brahmacharyam, Nishkapatada, Asteyamidi, Panchede, Yama, Parigirtida. There are many Sanskrit texts which explain yamas more or less in the same manner. Niyama, Akrodho, Gurusussusha, Shaujam, Akhara Lakhavam, Apramadasya Sadam, Panchede, Niyama. Sometimes, proper control, proper restraint when eating food, and respect for the teachers, respect, some kind of sense of respect, humility towards somebody who has given you something without expecting anything in return. So that actually violates the basic principle of modern economy and commerce. But that's the beginning of contentment. So long as we judge everything on the basis of utilitarian principle, you give something and you get back something in return. When you give something, we expect something in return. Also, when somebody gives you something, you give something, and there ends everything. So that sort of ultra pragmatic or maybe utilitarian give and take policy, maybe it is the way commerce and economics and finance and banking, all these things go according to these rules. But there is something beyond that. To be a civilized human being, to be an enlightened human being, we should go beyond that give and take policy. And that's the beginning of yoga life. So that's why all these restrictions, principles are given. Now, last time I discussed the 33rd sutras and the 34th. These are closely interrelated. And you will find Vyasa has something very strong to say on this subject. Not very pleasing language, almost like the language of the old Hebrew prophets, Elijah and others, the language used by John the Baptist, not very pleasant to hear, but they were all wonderful people. They had compassion, they were straightforward, they wanted to help humanity, but they used slightly unpleasant language so that people will listen to them. So that's their own grace. So you find Vyasa has something to say on this subject. Vitarka Badhane Pratipaksha Bhavanam, that's the 33rd sutra. What it essentially means is, when we try to practice yamas and niyamas, sometimes we may not fully succeed, brooding over past actions, samskaras, tendencies, mind wandering. We try to practice some self-restraint, but when we sit quiet, when we are not in the company of these higher ideas, mind wanders all around, and mind recollects and relives the past samskaras coming from previous life experiences. So what to do? So there is a remedy recommended here, Pratipaksha Bhavanam. So what we should do, we must cultivate the opposite thoughts. I give some examples in my previous session. Swami Vivekananda has written on this subject. He interprets this mean you should practice a thought different from the one which has possessed your mind. For example, when anger comes, think of love. I should be clear from the next verse. Patanjali's own meaning seems to be to think of evil consequences or the bad consequences that you may have to suffer, you may have to bear, or others will have to suffer. If you do not practice self-restraint and self-control. I shall try to interpret this in the light of Vyasa's own famous commentary. There are very celebrated verses from Vyasa's Bhashya. You know why Vyasa is so important? Patanjali Yoga Sutras would have been silent and inaccessible without Vyasa. Because Vyasa must be one of the great teachers of Yoga Sutras. Not necessarily the great Vyasa associated with Brahma Sutras or Bhagavata Purana or 18 Mahapuranas, 18 Upapuranas, no, or Vyasa Smriti. It may be a different Vyasa. But Vyasa actually means the great editor, the great classifier. Vyasadhyadu means editing, classifying, organizing. That's what it means. So Vyasa has something interesting to say. Yada asya brahmanasya. So those of you are reading this, maybe in translations, the word brahmana is used. Here, the word is used in the sense somebody who is an aspirant of higher life. A person who takes to yoga sadhanas, yoga practices, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, somebody who practices ahimsa, all these values. Such a person is meant by the word term brahmana here. Himsadeo vitarka jairen. What happens? Suppose a person gets possessed of a tendency to practice violence. Then what we must do? Hanishya maham abakarinam. He has done something wrong to me. I shall destroy him or something like that. These are the thoughts. We may not do that. A person may not do that. But such thoughts, sense of revenge, vindictiveness can possess a person and drive him blind. It could happen. Anutamabi vakshyami. Then I shall retaliate. Or another person may feel I shall speak falsehood to gain something, some kind of material benefit. Dravyamapi asya swikarishyami. That is opposite of aparigraha. I know I won't care for aparigraha. I shall practice parigraha. Parigraha means accepting gifts, things from others. It could mean, most probably, it could mean corruption or bribery. That's good. That could be the implication here. So there are commentators, not so very prominent like Vyasa, but some commentators have tried to tone down the language of Patanjali and also Vyasa. The idea is, suppose you try to accept something in a very illegal, wrong way, out of greed, because we don't practice asteya and aparigraha. So what happens? Our contentment or santosha. No contentment, no practice of non-possessiveness. So what happens? Such a person will accept things or take things from others. So anudamabi vakshami, the opposite of satya, anudam. I shall not practice falsehood. If such a person thinks that way, darishu chapi yavai bhavishyami parigriheshu chasya swami bhavishyami ityevam udmad pravana vitarka jwarena adidiptena badhyamanaka tat pradibatti paksha bhavaye. What it means? Tat pradibatti paksha means the opposite thought. What should we do? Such a person, he should practice the opposite of this. If a person feels like telling something false, then he should think of the advantages of speaking the truth. If a person feels a violent tendency within to vindictiveness, vengeance, retaliation, then one should practice this spiritual discipline, thinking of the glory, the greatness of non-violence, love, compassion for others. So what happens, even when we contemplate on this, a battle is taking place in our mind. One is a violent tendency, and it is being confronted by the opposite, the ideal of non-violence. So what happens? The violent tendency will come down. Greed, great desire for wealth, to the point of becoming possessed of that greed, which is self-destructive, which makes us miserable, it breaks our life. We know that, but we can't get out of this. So Vyasa says, you should practice tat pradipatti pakshan bhavayit. Pradipatti pakshan bhavayit means you should practice contemplating on the opposite thought. Pradipatti pakshan means the opposite thought currents one should practice. So then, as he gives an example, Ghoreshu samsarangareshu pachimanena maya sharanam upagataha sarvabhuda abhaypradanena yoga dharma sakhalu aham tyaktva vitarkan punastan adadanastulyaka shavrittena iti bhavaye. Here is a very strong language used. Such a person who feels a kind of inner impulse to do something wrong. This could happen. Maybe we may not be wonderful people, good people also sometimes when they are fully aware of what's happening in their own mind, then sometimes what happens, as Vyasa says, Anatam abhivakshyami, dirgamipyasya swikarishyami. I shall speak falsehood. I shall take everything from others. Whatever they give, I shall take without any sense of contentment, without any practice of aparigraha. In those, under those circumstances, one should practice pradipatti pakshan, the contemplation of the opposite tendencies, so that negative tendencies will become weaker, and we'll be able to practice self-restraint. And here is an example: roasted on the pitiless burning coal of the cycle of births. That's why Ghoreshu samsarangareshu pachimane namaya. So what, even if I become the richest man in the world, still I am going through these cycles of birth, life, enjoyment, death, and rebirth. It is a samsara. It's a moving cycle. And so, and here Pachimanena, so Vyasa says, roasted on this pitiless burning coal of these multiple cycles of birth, life, and death, and rebirth. I took refuge in the virtues of yoga. I tried to practice yoga, but still I am not able to succeed because the mind is contemplating. When I'm not meditating, when I'm not listening to higher ideas, when I'm not reading some wonderful books, the mind goes about wandering all over the world, looking for negative tendencies. And then here's a very strong expression to use, which better, at least it is at least a classical value. So I shall quote Vyasa, not very pleasant to hear, but just as you read Old Testament, you can listen to this. Then he says something very interesting. Shavurtene dibhavayit. Like a dog, I'm behaving like a dog. Remember, there is absolutely no cruelty to animals implied here. It's an ancient language. Dogs are wonderful animals, very grateful. Maybe the old language is something very interesting. Just like we can listen to this as a literary classic. So Vyasa was certainly a very compassionate person, compassionate towards all living beings, including dogs. But he's giving an example. He says, Yatha shwa vanta valehi tatha tyaktasya punaha adadana iteva madhi sutandreshu yujyam. What he says is, as a dog licks his vomits, maybe we can replace, instead of dog, a human being. He vomits and eats what he has vomited. So it is for me to take up thoughts and lines of action discarded by me as evil. See, it's a very wonderful recommendation given. When our mind uh, goes about wandering, mind wandering is at one point when it exceeds a limit, it is a psychological problem according to modern psychiatry. When it goes beyond it is the mother of creativity. All men and women of high creativity had this problem, mind wandering. Without mind wandering, you cannot be very creative. But mind wandering can sometimes be a psychological problem. By thinking of how much money I can accumulate, how much harm I can do to others out of a sense of vengeance and vindictiveness. So thinking, brooding over violent tendencies, evil tendencies, greedy tendencies, which will be harmful to others and harmful to ourselves. So, but I'm trying to get rid of this. That's what Vyasa says. A yoga practitioner, Brahmana is the word used here. Please don't mistake the word to be a person who is Brahmana by birth. The real meaning here is somebody who is taking to higher life. So if you read a translation, one can easily misunderstand. The meaning is an aspirant of yoga, a seeker of higher values in life. Such a person who is practicing yamas and niyamas, self-restraints, all these wonderful spiritual disciplines, but he is confronting this problems of his own mind. His own mind is not very friendly with him. So mind doesn't allow you to practice this higher discipline. So mind goes about wandering. So mind goes about wandering is like eating what we have vomited out. That's the meaning here. So what Vyasa says is, you have to understand this, this particular method described here in the context of similar ideas to Sutandreshu Yojyam. Whenever the Yoga Sutras discuss the importance of these disciplines, yamas and niyamas, non-violence, contentment, non-possessiveness, purity, when we try to practice all these great ideals, spiritual ideals, which are not necessarily religious values, which are spiritual values. Essentially, these are the sublime values that will help us to evolve a wonderful civilization and culture. But when we try to practice this, our own mind sometimes doesn't cooperate. The mind goes to opposite tendencies. Not physically, brooding over. That's the idea. Bhavanam means contemplating. Mind is contemplating on those things. Then we should contemplate on the opposite tendencies. Then what happens? The negative tendencies will be weakened. It becomes weaker and weaker, and we'll be able to practice these spiritual disciplines like self-restraint, non-violence, contentment, purity, and so on. That is the significance of this very, very important sutra. This together we should. The next sutra is also very important. That is the 34th one, but we have already discussed this earlier. Vitarka, himsadeha, krida, karita, anumodita, lobha, krodha, moha, purvakaha, mrudu, madhyadhi, matra, dukkha, ajnana, ananda phalaha, iti pratipaksha bhavanam. This is the kind of contemplating that you should do. Mean contemplating on the opposite thought to control and restrain negative tendencies. So what are these perverse thoughts? Sometimes, let us say himsa, violence, greed, possessiveness, never be happy, kind of always unhappy, looking for higher things, never being able to remain contented with anything. These are the problems you're facing. Then what we should do? These are the perverse thoughts, such as himsa, etc. Whether done, so there are certain terms used in the sutra. Those of you who got that sutra, you should remember. One is krita, certain wrong things, wrong actions done by the person himself. Karida, or he may have persuaded somebody else to do wrong actions, or he may have just approved or appreciated wrong actions done by others. All these can create negative tendencies. Even if we appreciate a wrongdoing done by others, that will sow the seed of discontentment, greed in our mind. Even without doing ourselves, if we persuade somebody else to do something wrong, that is not very different from doing oneself. And of course, if we do ourselves, it is direct involvement. So whether we do ourselves is called, the first one is krita. Karida means we got it done by another person. We persuaded somebody else to do something wrong. And anumodita means somebody else did something wrong and we applaud, we congratulate, we appreciate, we approve. That is not very different from our own doing the wrong things. Because at the mental level, when we appreciate a wrongdoing by another person, we are indirectly participating in the wrong action. That's it. At the psychological point of view, there is not very much of a difference. That's why this sutra, so the sutra should be read along with the 33rd sutra. So when we practice yamas and niyamas, we should keep this in mind. That we should not do ourselves, and we should not indirectly be responsible for doing something wrong by persuading another person to do that, or by approving or appreciating a wrong action done by another person. All these can color our mind and sow the seed of discontentment, worry, anxiety, all these things. Very, very, very similar to Buddha's Samyak Drishti, Samyak Vyayama, Samyak Ajiva, all this you can find in Samyak Karma, all you can Samyak Samadhi, you can find in Buddha's eightfold disciplines towards Nirvana. So all these are involved here. Next one is Ahimsa Pradisthayam Tasannidho Vairatyaga. Now what happens? This is something very interesting. When a person gets fully established in non-violence, in the ideal of non-violence, then all people, not even human beings alone, but even animals in the close proximity will have a tendency to practice non-violence. I think this can be explained in the light of some of the earlier sutras. In the earlier sutras we mentioned, our character throws around us an aura, and that aura that it creates kind of atmosphere around us is a result of our thoughts, our personality, not the physical personality, the real personality, which actually is a combination of mind and intellect and the senses, actions, thought currents, what principles the person stands for. All these constitute that subtle personality. So if a person practices non-violence, he's a great saint, those around him may have a tendency, may develop a tendency to practice non-violence. Remember, this is a reference to some of the great saints and sages who are fully established in non-violence. It doesn't mean that all people around a Christ or a Buddha will become like Christ or Buddha, not at all. But there will be a tendency for people around such a person, such a great saintly person who is a practitioner of yamas and niyamas, to equally vibrate to the same frequency of vibration of the person who is in their midst. Well, you can see how children or grandchildren behave in the presence of a grandmother or grandfather. That's something interesting. When they feel the grandmother, they see the grandmother may be 90-year-old, but she may be an embodiment of affection, love, and so children behave differently. So you can see, so there is an invisible, an undercurrent of human communication that's very strong and very intense, very real. That's what happens. In the Hindu mythologies, you can find a number of stories of the great sages of Vedic times and Puranas who used to communicate with ants, with animals. Well, not by training. A dog can be trained by a dog trainer. That's not the case here, remember. Instinctively, people around a great saintly person will have a tendency to practice similar virtues, not through training or practice. Natural tendency. You can find many such stories in the mythological books. Remember, mythology is mythology, but mythology cannot evolve out of a vacuum. A great mythological story may not be fully literally correct as a story, but behind the story there's a message. Without a background of reality, no myth can evolve. Behind every myth there is a remote and distant reality behind. So that's why Patanjali says ahimsa pradisthayam to sannidho vairatyaga. You can find. If you read the stories of great men and women who practiced compassion, goodness for others, service for humanity, total unselfishness, love for everyone, you find people, at least for the time being, there is a tendency for people around such a person to be compassionate, at least for the time being. Not that everyone will be transformed completely, not at all, because we get transformed according to our own samskaras. For that, we have to work. But there's a tendency for us to practice non-violence in the presence of a person who is fully established in the practice of non-violence. That's the implication of the 35th sutra. Satya pradisthayam kriya phalasrayatvam. Similarly, when a spiritual seeker gets fully established in satya, in truthfulness, then what happens? He will be able to, the persons around them will be able to practice truthfulness. Do you have any? Can you hear?
Yes, Maharaj, we can hear you.
There's a little battery problem. I think they're trying to rectify that. But you can hear okay, I believe. Okay, then we continue. So that is the 36th sutra. The 37th one is Asteya Pradisthayam Sarva Ratnopasthanam. Those who practice total abstention from theft, I mean, those who don't care for possessing other people's properties or something, what happens, that person will be able to, it means Sarva Ratnopasthanam, it means he'll be able to get jewels. Here you have to remember some of the sutras should be understood against the social, cultural background of the age in which the sutras were written. So people who practice truthfulness, everything will be added to them. You can find similar teachings in the Bible. If you practice certain higher spiritual disciplines, then things will be added to you. You will get things without your going in search of them. Those who run away from material pleasures, sometimes they will come to them. So such ideas we find. That's the meaning here. Satyapradisthayam kriya phalasetu. That is, when a person practices truthfulness, what happens, the words of such a great yogi who is established in truthfulness will acquire the power of making them fruitful. Means whatever they say will become true. I mean, a person who has never deviated from truth, whatever he or she says will become true. That's very interesting. In fact, that explains, partially it explains the what we call miracles. You can find such stories in all religious traditions of great saints and sages. In all traditions you get such stories. Somebody who blessed him and he came to him. Somebody who, well, I shall pray to God, and immediately happened. You call it miracle. The greatness of Patanjali's approach is he doesn't believe in miracles. He sees he observes, he finds a cause-effect link. And once you can see a rational explanation, once you see a cause-effect link, then there is no need to resort to some kind of occult explanation of what happens. Somebody who has never deviated from the path of truth, if that person prays, or if he's still a higher person, is a great saint, if he speaks, the word happens to become a reality in course of time. The word, where does the power come from? It's not a miracle. It is the result of practicing higher values. That's the idea behind it. Similarly, somebody who never wanted anything, who's always contented all the time, who is an embodiment of contentment. If that person wants something, everything will come to him. But without seeking anything, he can get whatever he wants. But he never wants anything. That's why it comes to him. If he really wants something, they have to work hard. Then only it comes to us. If we don't want anything, then without any effort, what we don't want will come to us. So that is the greatness of this sutra here. Brahmacharya Pradisthaya Viri Labha. Of course, this is a very so great sages like Vivekananda in modern times, and of course also in the monastic traditions of Christianity and other traditions where monasticism was emphasized. You find that those who practice this chastity and higher values, they will get a kind of unique inner power because they don't waste their spiritual resources. They're able to conserve the spiritual resources. So that's it. In fact, some of the greatest men and women who accomplish great things, not only in spiritual life, but even in science and philosophy areas, who dedicated the whole life to a higher idea, became great. You can find with musicians, both in the Eastern and Indian traditions. Great classical musicians. I'm talking about, see, in Indian tradition, there were great classical musicians in both Hindustan into South Indian musical traditions. Those who were men of renunciation, those who sang only for God to hear, those who rejected offers of treasure from kings, and everything came to them. And they practiced purity all their life, and they became immortal musicians. You can find such examples in Western tradition as also. Please remember, I'm talking about a great classical musical tradition. That should be kept in mind, especially musical tradition with a spiritual orientation. Because when you sing a song or compose a song with a spiritual orientation, it should come from a higher source. You are not composing or singing a song to please somebody, to get wealth or anything. You are doing it as a spiritual practice. And out of that effort, only a unique piece of sublime music can evolve. So that's all because of their pure life that brings out the inner spiritual resources. That's the idea behind. I think we will conclude today, and then you can ask questions, and most welcome. We'll be happy to try to respond to these questions. Most welcome. Thank you. Namaskar.
Namaskar. Hari Om Swamiji.
Yeah.
Swamiji, I have three questions, but I'll ask two of them which are very related now, and then we'll circle back if there is time at the end.
Actually, I would rather prefer if you can put one question, then
Yeah,
I
exactly.
because otherwise I have to remember every question. So you can put one question, and after I answer that question, the next question. It will be very, very, very helpful to the listeners also.
Yes, Swamiji. So actually, the two of my questions are very related to each other, so I will ask them together.
Okay.
So the first thing is when we talk about ahimsa, right, and especially in India, there is always a lot of talk about ahimsa because of Gandhi and the related legacy. So when we talk about ahimsa, is this just physical violence, or also does this include a sort of mental violence? Because mental violence is a big part
Yeah.
of the kind of hinsa that is around. And a related question is, now Arjuna brings this up as a point in the Gita, and then Krishna says, while not fighting the war might be less ahimsa than actually fighting the war, because you are avoiding potential himsa. Or a related example in today's world is, say, vaccinations, right? To prepare vaccinations, you need to have some sort of tests which are being run on other animals, which can count as himsa. So where are these lines of ahimsa drawn?
So then you are right. It's very difficult to draw the line. I shall explain this in the light of Arjuna. The problem of Arjuna, this first chapter. If you look at Arjuna, not only from the point of view of the Bhagavad Gita, but of the whole Mahabharata, Arjuna, when he came to the battlefield, he was determined to save his own family, his own mother, and his relatives, the poor people, the children, the old person, the widows, and so on. So he came as a protector, so that if he can fight this war, he will be able to protect the whole country, the subjects of the whole nation, from the atrocities of the Duryodhanas and others. That was the argument. And when Arjuna actually tried to justify inaction, going away from the battlefield, Arjuna was really not talking like Buddha or Gandhi. Arjuna was talking like a coward. So in the Mahabharata and also the Gita itself, there are many references which give a clear picture of the real nature of Arjuna. Arjuna had certain great qualities. He was a man of judgment. At least he was a man who felt this conflict. That's because he was a cultured person. So he felt, why should I fight this? I would rather won't do any of these things. But if you are not fought this war, then what would have happened? They were having much more violence, much more violence. You can find this in the context of every country. I don't want to refer to things which could be controversial, but great men who unified nations, who worked for the abolition of social inequalities, who had to resort to war because if they had not done it, they would have been actually responsible for the continuation of social inequalities and injustices. That would have meant much greater violence than the violence which they have to practice in war. So, as per Gandhi, Gandhi made a point. See, I tell you, a historical fact. Uh, of course, this is part of Indian history. Those who don't know, but I shall explain this because there is an important point which I want to make. During the Second World War, before the Second World War, Indians were not willing to fight. Actually, 2.9 million Indian soldiers participated in the Second World War. Those of you who don't know history, if you read Churchill's history of the Second World War, of any so-called standard histories written by Churchill or any other historians, they always use the word British forces. It was the Gurkhas and Rajputs and Sikhs who actually fought in Africa against uh, Field Marshal Rommel under Montgomery. So you can find France and other countries, Spain, Italy, you find large number of cemeteries for Indian soldiers, tribute to Indian soldiers. So they were actually, initially, they were not willing to participate in the Second World War because British rule. Then Gandhi actually started encouraging Indians to join the army. Remember, Gandhi was the prophet of non-violence. Why did Gandhi encourage Indians? He went around India, encouraging Indians to join the armed forces, and of course, their names are all British forces. Means large number of them were Indians. Australians were called Australians. Canadians called Canadians, but Indians were called British forces. If you read the history of Second World War, you can see that. 2.9 million was the number of Indian soldiers who fought from time to time in the Second World War. Now, why did Gandhi encourage Indians to join to get themselves recruited to fight the Nazis? Because Gandhi felt Nazism was the most violent creed that should be defeated. So Gandhi was hell-bent on getting Indian support for the British war effort, not only in terms of human material, but also in terms of not only human resources, but also other resources. So where do you draw the line? This is something very important to remember. So there are many, many instances in history. And Gandhi himself, why I'm mentioning Gandhi, there are other examples. I'm mentioning Gandhi because he's the most well-known prophet or exponent of non-violence in modern times. But same Gandhi actually encouraged Indians to join the British forces, British army, and join the war effort to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War. So where do you draw the line? So the point is, if by inaction you become indirectly responsible for a lot more miseries, a lot more violence, a lot more destruction than otherwise, then your inaction, which you may interpret as non-violence, is actually violence. This is an important point. So very difficult to draw the line. You can draw the line, you can explain this only in the context of historical events. In the Second World War, 1930-39, there was a pact, there was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. There was a pact between involving Britain and Hitler, 1930 to 38, I believe. The pact, and Neville Chamberlain thought that he can avoid war and violence through a treaty. But that treaty was responsible indirectly because it encouraged Hitler to launch an attack against Poland Czechoslovakia, already. Suppose Britain had not joined a treaty in 1938, Britain had given a strong warning to Hitler. Then perhaps the Second World War maybe would have been delayed. At least it would not, maybe it would not have happened. I mean, on the same scale. So you can find an attempt to avoid war created a war. And an attempt to avoid violence became a cause of far greater violence. So that's why Sri Krishna told Arjuna, if you don't do your duty as a soldier, the soldier's duty is to protect the women, for the unarmed, helpless people who will be otherwise suffer a lot. So Sri Krishna told him, through your inaction, which you call non-violence, a practice of non-violence, you become a cause of far greater violence. That's the logic of Krishna's message in the Gita. You can find this principle throughout history. If you look at it. Okay. You can imagine Gandhi encouraging Indians to join British war efforts.
Yeah.
Okay? And Gandhi actually, there were many Indians, patriotic Indians, who were against it. But Gandhi had a better sense, because if it don't happen, it was a great help, because all the martial races of India joined. So you can find this throughout history.
Great point, Swami. Thank you.
Thank you. Bobby Coleman maybe can further elaborate. I'm happy this is a very important topic, because frequently when you talk about non-violence, we think we have this. Bobby Coleman, can you add something from this to what I said just now?
I encourage the other students to contact me if they wish to elaborate. But all I'll say is that Neville Chamberlain doomed many people through his appeasement treaty. Yeah. It was obviously, in the light of history, a grave error in terms of the applications of ahimsa.
Yeah. So thank you for your question. It took us all the way to European history, but it's a fact.
Thanks, Swamiji.
One can imagine, Maharaj, a mother who sees a child run into the street, who fails to scream and alert the driver to the hazard of potentially harming the child for fear of upsetting anybody, would not be practicing ahimsa in the proper fashion.
Could you elaborate this? I didn't really get it.
A protective act that would be aggressive in a different context,
yeah,
such as a mother shouting at a driver to not harm a child in the street. There is a common sense test to these things.
Yeah.
Where a mother who acts in a way that would in a different context be considered violent is, in this way, her aggression is preventative.
Yeah, really, their aggression is really non-aggression. If she had not done it, and by not alerting the driver, if there is a problem, if the child gets injured, then her inaction will be violent, and her action, her scream, will be non-violent.
Swamiji, if I could take a quick moment, this is actually codified in the law and as a matter of common law in criminal justice terms. Now, when a violent criminal is incarcerated, it is not merely punitive.
Yeah.
In a restorative justice sense, it also removes that criminal from the opportunity to do violence again. So we view this kind of violence, to take the liberty away from somebody, in a way as an act of nonviolence overall, not merely to satisfy the retributive instincts of an aggrieved party. Forgiveness is inherent. And if it goes too far, then it's an error. Then it would be an act of violence. But the mere fact of protecting the public from somebody who is rampaging violently is a reasonable act of nonviolence.
Precisely. No, real, it's a fact. If you read Gandhi more carefully, Gandhi has written a number of articles, Young India. Gandhi's complete works run into almost 90 volumes, huge volumes. All his writings have been translated in English. So he has elaborated. He was not a great philosopher, but he was a great thinker. Not an academic philosopher, but a great thinker. So he has elaborately explained many of these subtle points. He says, the non-violence is for the strong and for the brave, not for the coward, not for the inactive. The highest non-violence mentioned here, to be very frank with you, in Patanjali's context, historically, it was meant for individuals who lived in forest hermitages and who practiced these virtues. That is an important point to remember. Of course, today when we study Yoga Sutra, we forget this historical fact, and it is very significant. So we should not forget it. But yoga system was fundamentally, it was designed for individual spiritual seekers who lived away from society, who lived in hermitages or maybe mountain caves. But in modern times, Swami Vivekananda was the one who actually gave a very wonderful interpretation to yoga, to Patanjali's ideas. And after reading them in modern English, you can see it as a universal application far beyond the hermitages or the mountain caves of the ascetics. It has got a universal social relevance. It is something, maybe some of these values. Yamas and niyamas should be taught in our schools. Yamas and niyamas in their elaborate form should be taught in our schools. They are not part of a church. So that doesn't violate the principle of separation between church and state. Yamas and niyamas constitute some of the fundamental cardinal principles which are necessary for the preservation of certain values and for the evolution of a cultured, civilized society. So, right in modern times, right now it has got a relevance that goes far beyond what it should have had maybe when Patanjali wrote these sutras. Essentially, historically, many of these yoga practices were disciplines were practiced by Buddhists or Jains and also Hindu ascetics in their own ashramas or monasteries or mountain caves or forest hermitages. Vivekananda in 19th century, the later half of, it was the end of 19th century, gave it a modern interpretation. There were certain Yoga Sutra translations published even before Vivekananda. But if you read it, it looks so archaic. It's almost, it doesn't seem to have any connection with the world in which we live today. But when you read Vivekananda, he connects the yoga psychology and yoga teachings to modern society, to the world in which we are all living today. So I'm trying to give it a broad interpretation, emphasizing its relevance to the times in which we are living. That's what I'm trying to. And I'm very grateful to those of you who asked this question because it gives me a chance to explain and elaborate further many of these ideas.
Swamiji, I see two hands up. I don't know which one came first, but I see one from Yogi and one from Niru.
Niru goes first. Go ahead, Niru. Then after that.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Swamiji. Question, you mentioned, you talked about how like we absorb or we absorb the qualities of people around us. So if somebody is particularly spiritual, that we can absorb that from them. In the convert opposite sense, if we're surrounded by people who may not be like that, how can, for example, at work where we don't really have a chance to, not be in that environment, how are we supposed to detach from that so that we don't absorb all the negative tendencies or the negative implications of that?
Exactly. Now, when you go to a person, when you meet a person who is fully established in these great virtues and qualities like ahimsa, non-violence, or satya, like that, then if we are also spiritual seekers interested in this subject, but not able to succeed much in this, but still we are sincere seekers, then we'll be highly benefited. If we are not necessarily serious students of yoga, not much interested, but we are cultured persons with some higher values in life, which we try to follow and practice. And if you go to a person, if you meet a person who's established in ahimsa, non-violence, and truthfulness, then also you will be benefited because you suddenly see a sublime example and you get a feeling, well, this is something which I should try to practice. If you are a student and seeker of yoga but not fully successful, then you'll be highly benefited. Still, if you are just a cultured person with some higher values, then you'll be very much benefited. But there are people who are totally opposed to many of these ideas. They may not be much benefited. Of course, they will be benefited if they meet some very great, outstanding saints and sages. Then also, if there are some good samskaras in their mental system, it's called chittam, then they will be influenced, they will be benefited. But otherwise, it doesn't happen because the two minds can and should connect to be benefited. But generally, those who have some higher values in life will have a natural tendency to connect with a higher idea that you find in the life of a great man or great woman. You can see. I hope that answer is clear.
That's helpful. One small follow-up question is, it makes sense in connecting with somebody who is high spiritual person and you absorbing the positive qualities from them. But in the instance that does it work the other way, that you might accidentally absorb the negative qualities from other people who might be in your that you might interact with?
Well, I couldn't clearly hear what you said, but I shall try to answer. You mean if somebody goes to a person with negative qualities, will be affected by that? That's what you are asking?
Yeah, and how do we, reduce the impact of that?
The same thing happen. It is true. It could happen. If that person who is going to meet with another individual with a lot of negative qualities, if this person himself has a lot, say, negative tendency, then negative tendencies will be reinforced. You will develop an attraction for them more and more. That's why students, especially young minds, should be encouraged to associate with higher ideas and associate with persons from whom they can hear and they can get higher values and higher ideas. Young growing children will be very easily benefited because they will absorb these words and it becomes some scars in their minds. It will be very effective. Thank you for the question.
Go ahead, Yogi. Your question next.
Pranam Maharaj.
Brahmacharya Pratishtitayam Virya Labha. Today's youngsters are talking about premarital sex and how many partners they can have, and every advertisement we see sensual inducements. How do we explain this concept to children
In
these
fact,
days?
that's why
Thank you.
yeah, that's why teaching Yoga Sutras are more important, more relevant for our times. So, what you explain, what you described now, further reinforces the need and the importance of teaching these values. There is an alternate paradigm possible for modern youngsters. There are many things else, of course, which are not always very desirable things, but there are also wonderful things, part of a heritage, spiritual, cultural heritage. Uh, that what you said just now, it's true, it's happening everywhere in the world. That further underlines and reinforces the need for um, teaching higher values, important traditional values. That's true.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. You're most
Maharaj,
welcome. Yeah.
there is a question in the internet, Facebook, by Michelle Mary. She asks, how does one handle being a target because of their kind nature? What if their loving kindness attracts those who take advantage of it?
That's the problem. Yeah. So we should be aware of this and try to practice discretion and discerning wisdom, because our kindness sometimes can become attraction for trouble for ourselves. So we should try to be careful about it. Day-to-day common life experience, we cannot, a normal person living in this world in modern times may not be able to practice kindness beyond a limit. But mentally, the fact that people do not reciprocate, they sometimes take advantage of our kindness, that should not affect, that should not be allowed to influence our mind. Still, we should stick to our own ideal of kindness and compassion and charity and goodness. But at the same time, we should try to be realistic. We should be aware of the possibility of these problems. Otherwise, if a person gets a lot of negative reactions from people around trying to take advantage of his or her kindness, then at some point he may stop being kind. He may think that kindness is actually invites problems. So better to be one of the common masses. That's true. So that's why it's important to practice kind of discretion and uh, an awareness, self-awareness of these problems. Yeah, that's true.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have still almost 5 minutes. Those of you who have anything to ask, most welcome.
Swamiji, how do you how do you talk to the kids? You know, like they wouldn't be interested in Patanjali Yoga Sutra or anything. You know, how do we get them started? You mentioned, you know, you have to instill all the values and other things, but you know, the kids, I don't know, how do we start bringing them to this kind of knowledge and awareness?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, these important spiritual, cultural values, they can be found uh, in many traditions, many great saints and sages, even great national leaders of different civilizations, different cultures, you can find these examples. So if you can narrate to them stories of these great men and women who are embodiments of some of these higher values, that will be one way to teach them. We cannot teach Patanjali Yoga Sutras to small little children. That's not possible. But these values, being the importance of non-violence, how non-violence makes us happy, contented, how if you do something wrong to another person, one day it will come back to us. That's what. That's one of the ways of confronting negative tendencies, as Vyasa says. Pratibhaksha Bhavana means. So we should teach children the importance of practicing these higher values, and also the undesirable consequences of not practicing some of these values. Along with, of course, along with emphasizing the importance of study, getting high grades, they have to be trained to become good students, score well in the examinations. But there is something as important as scoring high grades. To make life more complete, we should be able to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Getting very high grade and very wonderful job, that's fine. But to remain mentally healthy, psychologically and culturally healthy and vigorous, we need some higher values so that you'll be able to enjoy the fruits of our labor, working hard and getting high grades. That's the way we should approach the subject with small children. You cannot talk to them about contentment the way we do, but contentment is possible if you work very hard for a higher goal. Still, you can be very content, satisfied. There's no doubt, there's no need to be inactive to enjoy contentment, to have contentment. Along with the action, we can have contentment, santosha, no doubt about it. Some of these values you can find illustrated in the lives of great saints, not just saints only, great political leaders, social leaders, great men and women of charity. You can find these grand examples in all walks of life, in all cultures and traditions. You can find.
Thank you, Swamiji.
So thank you. If you've got anything more to ask, I'm most welcome. Still, we have about 5 minutes more. So thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Those of you who want to subscribe to our channel, you can go to our website and you get information there how to, or you can directly write. You can get the email address temple@svedanta.org. You can find in our website. For website, you can just Google Vedanta Society of Northern California, San Francisco. Thank you. Namaskar.